Wait a minute, you might be thinking. You already did a video on this. And you're correct, I did make a video 2 years ago. Since then, I've grown as both a content creator and a Hellenist, and so have many who have followed my work since then, so I've decided to revisit some 101 topics in my new longer format to allow for a deeper exploration. You might recognize some of what I have to say, as I do plan on building on the original script, but there will be a lot that is either new to you or additional exploration of the concepts that I presented only briefly before. Whether you're a beginner or experienced, I hope you'll find something useful or insightful in this update work. So, without further ado, let's get into prayer in Greek religion. Kairete. Prayer is communication with the gods in the most direct way we can, by opening up our mouths and speaking to them in earnest. Yes, prayer in ancient Greece was largely done verbally and not mentally, though as we'll see later, there were some circumstances where it was done internally. We only have written and archaeological evidence to go by, which can be useful, but it doesn't represent the whole of practices and opinions in Greece any more than reading a selection of random fiction novels at the store will tell you the whole of any modern cultures. So remember that nothing in this video should invalidate personal experiences that you might have with prayer. Prayer is a lexeme, or a term that is related to a family of words illustrating often complex concepts, so trying to define it exactly is a bit of a struggle, but I'll do my best here. Prayer is communication with one or more gods intended for a specific outcome, be it thanks, a request for something, or even just to honor the god or gods. It is an essential component of charis, for just as one must communicate healthily about our needs, concerns, and gratitude with loved ones, so too it is with the gods. I'll focus on a reconstructed or revived approach here, meaning that we'll be looking to history to guide what a tradition in the modern day could look like. That doesn't mean this is the only way to pray, but it does give us a firm foundation of what did work in ancient times when the culture who first came into contact with these gods honored them for centuries. The value in tradition comes from its efficacy and ability to unite people under a shared identity and praxis. Though modern Hellenists who are not Greek don't magically become Greek when we worship the theoi, we can find common ground in reconstructed or revived traditions to grow stronger as a community and potentially deepen our relationships with the theoi. It takes time to get used to traditional prayer structures if you choose to use them, but in my experience, they eventually become a natural extension of prayer, even when you pray freely without something pre-written. This video will be divided into 3 parts. First, we'll take a look at the why of prayer, the various motivations behind why you might pray, and what you can expect when you do. The second part deals with the preparations for prayer and the attitude internally that one would be expected to bring to the shrine or altar. Finally, we'll look at the structures of prayer and some of the traditional ideas surrounding prayer's structures in ancient times, including a few modern examples that I wrote specifically to show you how these prayers work. Prayer is the core of any religious practice that includes reciprocity or relationships with divine beings of any kind, so it's one of the most important things we need to understand when reviving a tradition. Part 1. Why pray? This is not going to be an argument for why you should believe in the theoi if you don't already feel a call. Sorry to disappoint any atheists or anti-theists in my audience who are looking for a fight. Everything I'm about to say is addressed to those who already feel some interest or pull toward the Greek gods and might want to start a relationship with them. Before we dig into history, I want to address some hangups that I've heard in the Xenia Bridge Discord server and elsewhere around the term prayer. Prayer in Christianity is often just a wish list for the Christian god with some praise sprinkled in here and there and not much else. Many pagans grow up resentful of the term and fall in love with the structure and praise found in ritual, not realizing that ritual is, well, a ritualized structure to prayer. My friend Beafeld over at Wind in the World Tree did a video on this in the term worship, and I agree with a lot of what he said in it. Personal prayer is an essential component to connection with the gods. If you've only ever read older scholars on ancient Greece, you might get the impression that the ancient Greek religion was entirely an affair of the polis, or the city-state, and those elected to represent it by the citizenry. We have the most information on festivals and civic rights after all, and the poloi had good reason to keep records of sacrifices that they gave and how much they cost, who got what priestly position, and whether or not they fulfilled their duties in that regard. Contrary to this picture from scholarship, though, the majority of interaction the average citizen would have with the gods would be personal, in the context of their oikos, which is a word that at once means both home and family, including those of the household that were not family by blood, but still joined the family in their rights, such as slaves. Because yes, there was slavery in ancient Greece, and no, that doesn't mean that it was okay, it just needs to be mentioned because it was there. Ritual and reciprocity with the gods, in the form of prayers, hymns, offerings, libations, etc., constituted much of the life of the ancient Greek from birth to death. Several days after any birth, any new child would undergo a rite in which the central hearth was circled while carrying the baby, singing hymns and offering sacrifices to introduce them to Hestia as a new member of the house. Similarly, when a woman got married, the wedding ceremony included hymns and libations to several gods and a full ritual ceremony to introduce her to the oikos of her new husband, passing her out of the oikos of her father. These rites of passage were clearly social, but also deeply spiritual, serving a key function for both humans themselves and in our relationship with the gods. I did an entire video about these sorts of rites that were done at funerals as well, so the gods were present at every moment of our lives. Take a look at the link in the iCard if you're interested in that. Hesiod states in Works and Days, "But do you turn your foolish heart altogether away from these things, and as far as you are able, sacrifice to the deathless gods purely and cleanly, and burn rich meats also, and at other times propitiate them with libations and incense, both when you go to bed and when the first holy light comes back, that they may be gracious to you in heart and spirit, and so that you may buy another's holding and not another yours." Which tells us that in the archaic era, it was considered eusebes, or pious, to offer twice a day, once when you go to bed and once when you get up in the morning, and that typically these offerings would be a libation of wine and burned incense, with animal offerings given when they were capable. I talk in my video about offerings about why we don't give animal offerings in the modern day. Link is in the iCard if you missed it. Prayer always accompanied offerings, and these simple daily prayers and offerings likely comprise the core of ancient interactions with the gods. Piety and religious observance was so essential to Greek life that they didn't even have a word equivalent to the English word religion, or any words that distinguish the civic religion from the personal ways that everybody interacted with the gods in their everyday life. The majority of the queries at the oracles of Delphi, Dodona, Claros, and Didyma were personal in nature, dealing with everyday concerns of a major sort, and the oracle mongers in the Hellenistic era and later found a receptive audience to fill this need at home, with less expense and time taken than a trip afar might have entailed. Certain omens and signs of epiphaneia, or religious experience directly with the gods, were known to many, and wandering mantis, or seekers, could be paid a fee to interpret others that were less known or overt, but clearly divine. The Greeks saw the gods in everything, from the thousands of gods of the seas, to nymphs dwelling in sacred trees, to gods who ruled over everything from piety to music to art to agriculture to the very fate of every individual human from birth to death. These gods were not the gods of these things, quote unquote, but rather shimmering individuals, the majority of which could build both personal and collective relationships with humans, and clearly were portrayed by the poets as wanting to. Even some of the philosophers, such as Plutarch in his work on superstition, states that it's natural for humans to want to pray and adore the gods. The pleasantest things that men enjoy are the festal days and banquets at the temples, initiations and mystic rites, and prayer and adoration of the gods. But why should most people feel good praying to the gods? Simply put, the gods are bigger and more powerful than us, and acknowledging this necessitates admiration, veneration, and potentially creates superstition, which I'll define similarly to Theophrastus as fear of the gods. If you've ever had an experience with a deity where they allowed some portion of themselves near enough to experience it, the feeling of awe, overwhelm, love, and holy terror that overcomes you might drive you to prayer. So too can the realization that the power and influence of the gods can allow for boons and blessings that potentially might help you get ahead in life, be that material success or something less defined, such as assistance in the matter of health or mental well-being. Plato and Aristotle both saw prayer as essential to enriching your character and pursuing virtue, because close proximity to the gods through honoring them encourages us to emulate their virtues in our own lives. Aristotle especially thought that virtue itself is primarily learned through habituation, so regular offering and praise to the gods about what is virtuous and amazing about them will help us see what is virtuous and praiseworthy in human action as well. The offerings we give also remind us that the gods play a part in, and thereby deserve, a portion of all of our good fortune and successes, and are always there when we need them in our lowest points, even if just as a reminder that we have what it takes to get through it. The gods are in and through everything. Their theoi compose parts of every aspect of human life, from Hestia connecting us to the gods through the sacred hearths, to Hecate, Hera, and Artemis protecting us and our births, to Demeter seeing to the grain as it grows from the fertile earth and ensuring the fertility of the animals many depend on for milk and eggs, to the muses who send us dancing to brilliant song and distract us from the struggles of our lives with inspired stories, to Zeus maintaining the very order upon which the universe spins, to Hades and Persephone receiving us into their realm at the end. Regular prayer and offering enables a recognition of the myriad of roles the gods play in our lives, and opens our eyes to the thousands of threads of influence they weave through every aspect of our existence. We cannot help but be awed in the presence of such majesty, but these revelations only come through experience, through these relationships built through time and effort. Prayer paired with offering are the core foundations for reciprocity, or charis with the gods. The joy of giving and receiving from humans to the gods and from the gods back to us can only be accessed to prayer, offering, and the revelations we receive as a consequence of that offering in the Greek worldview. Together, regular prayers and offerings constitute piety, Eusebeia, both a goddess who oversaw human pious actions and was said to be married to Law, Nomos, mother of justice in the Orphica fragments, and piety was considered essential to the pursuit of virtue and maintaining a relationship with the gods. Which makes a lot of sense if you think about it. How can you build a relationship with anyone unless you spend time with them? Prayer and ritual create a separate space for us to be with the gods, because their nature is different from ours, being disembodied minds of great power, not hindered by mortality and the perpetual fear of death or disease. The maintenance of Eusebeia is essential to these relationships, and includes with it the willingness to do something, even if it is small, to honor the gods whenever you can. Ideally in the morning or at night, as Hesiod suggests, but even if it's in the middle of the day and only once, something small is essential. Approaching the gods every day and praying creates a stable charis, building the cycle of reciprocity with even modest offerings, and strengthening the habits that help us to maintain these relationships throughout our entire lifetime. Again, think about a husband, wife, partner of some kind, or even a close friend. If you just stopped putting effort into the relationship for months, maybe even years, what would happen to it? I'm not saying the gods are going to reject you if you don't offer and pray daily. Do what you can. Not every friend wants to talk with you every day, but some kind of regular contact is a must to maintain any relationship. And just like a friend or partner would want you to enjoy your time spent with them, and if you treated it like a burden, they might not just bug off, but they might get concerned and ask you why you seem so miserable when spending time together is supposed to be enjoyable. Why continue a relationship with someone you don't like? In fact, there are a few different ideas around what our internal state should look like when we approach an altar or shrine. Part 2. Preparations and attitudes for prayer. Inner purity can be a bit of a trigger phrase for some folks, as it immediately brings to mind fundamentalist Christians and prohibitions on sex. Sex pollutes physically, and that pollution can be taken care of with a lustral washing and a plain old shower, but inner purity can only be attained through observance of specific codes of ethics and attitudes when approaching the shrine or altar. It has nothing to do with sexual conduct unless you're talking about violating oaths taken at marriage, if such oaths include monogamy. Then the agos of oath breaking applies, if your oaths were sworn by the gods or by the river Styx. Otherwise, let's talk a bit more about the proper attitude and ritual preparation for prayer. Hesiod refers to the essential nature of a proper attitude and preparation before approaching the gods in numerous passages and works and days. In lines 737 through 741, following a number of prescriptions regarding ritual purity, such as not approaching the hearth for offerings after sex and not boning after a funeral, he tells us, "Never cross the sweet flowing water of ever-rolling rivers afoot unless you have prayed, gazing into the soft flood, and washed your hands in the clear lovely water. Whoever crosses a river with hands unwashed of wickedness, the gods are angry with him and bring trouble upon him afterwards." Nearly every river in Greece was considered a divinity in its own right, and many offerings were placed in rivers or given at the riverside when crossing them. Nymphs were also heavily associated with sacred rivers and springs. They were known to curse those who befouled rivers in a number of ways, such as defecating or urinating in them, or leaving refuse in the water to be carried away. Essentially, Hesiod is describing an encounter with a river god. He tells us we must first wash our hands in the flowing water, which, if you recall my video on miasma or kernips, lustral water, flowing water was considered sacred and purifying, and to pray to the gods while gazing into the water to focus the prayer. This is a different prescription than most prayers, as we'll get into in the section on ways to pray, as most prayer to Uranic or sky deities was done standing, palms up, eyes skyward. Effectively, we're told that if we don't wash away the impurity of our deeds and thoughts with a focus on divinity in the space we're crossing, the gods will get upset and send agos after the person crossing. The word for wickedness Hesiod here, kakotes, is specifically referenced elsewhere throughout Works and Days and through Homer as referencing moral badness. Hesiod gives a number of descriptions of what a kakotes man does, including ignoring justice by passing bad judgments on foreigners because it brings them personal profits. These are people who are set in their quote-unquote wicked deeds, and in earlier passages, particularly 238 through 250, he lays out what awaits their entire community if rulers especially act this way. But for those who practice violence and cruel deeds, far-suiting Zeus, the son of Kronos, ordains a punishment. Often, even a whole city suffers for the bad man who sins and devises presumptuous deeds, and the son of Kronos lays a great trouble upon the people, famine and plague together, so that men perish away and their women do not bear children, and their houses become few, through the contriving of Olympian Zeus. And again, at another time, the son of Kronos destroys either their wide army or their walls, or else makes an end to their ships at sea. You princes, mark well this punishment, you also, for the deathless gods are near among men, and mark all those who oppress their fellows with crooked judgment, and heed not the anger of the gods. Yikes. Coming back to the first passage about hand-washing, prayer, and crossing a river, Hesiod is telling us that we must first recognize the divinity of a river through prayer and proper reverence, with our eyes cast on the water, giving our full focus and attention to the sacred washing ceremony. Only then will our hands and thereby our deeds be washed, which would then give us the necessary purity to cross the river in the presence of the divine. Theognis, a poet who likely lived sometime in the mid to late 600s BCE, also had a lot to say about what inner purity and the right attitude toward the gods looked like. His poems often focused on straight thought, referenced in Works and Days 7 when Hesiod tells us that Zeus makes straight what was once crooked in reference to exacting justice when unjust things have been done. We find references to goodness being an alignment of the mind toward what is real and an alignment of words and intentions in line 1185 of the Theognidia, as well as in lines 87 through 90. The former reads, "A good mind and tongue few men have both. Few are those who treasure both." This word for mind here is nous. The word for tongue, or words, is glossa. Few people's words match their intentions and thereby their actions, and goodness and purity entail that they must both be in alignment. This is echoed in the latter lines 87 through 90. "Do not love me with words, keeping your mind and thoughts elsewhere. If you love me, and if you have a faithful mind, either love me, having made your mind pure, or renounce me and hate me and quarrel with me openly. He who has a twofold mind and says one thing, he is a terrible friend, Kernes, and is better as an enemy than as a friend." The word here for pure is katharos, which is also used in reference to ritual and religious purity. Themes tying the two together exist all over the poems that compose the Theognidia, as how humans treat each other is inexorably linked to how we treat the gods. Remember, the majority of what incites agos are actually crimes against other humans: murder, harming suppliants, broken xenia, violence against parental figures without provocation, oath-breaking, etc. There's a prayer to the god Apollon in the same set of poems that asks him and Zeus to guide aright our tongue and mind, referring to the city as a whole as a subject of the prayer, that they may offer to the gods in earnest, focusing on the offering and not the war against the Persians that was ongoing when the poem was composed. This shows the second layer of inner purity underscored by the first passage, the total internal focus on the task at hand from Hesiod, paired with the necessity of the alignment of purpose and actions referenced in the other passages. If you approach the altar feeling as though it is a chore rather than celebrating and treasuring the time you spend with the gods, you're approaching in a state of impurity, and your prayer outcomes will reflect that. It's one thing to be sad about things going on in your life. In my experience, that at least is not barred. I've literally sobbed at the altar begging Artemis to help Luna when she was hospitalized, and the goddess granted my prayer. But what I am saying is that the approach to the altar shouldn't be the source of your sadness, and some comfort and positivity and peace should also be the result of the action of offering and praying. Remember the quote from Plutarch earlier about the superstitious man? I would extend fear of angering of the gods when approaching and offering to this same cross-purpose issue with inner purity. If you're hyper-focused on doing everything perfectly and offering the right offerings and constantly criticizing yourself and ruminating on fear and things that go wrong, your mind is at cross-purposes with itself. You're outwardly praying and performing ritual actions to contact the gods, but internally the focus is all on yourself and the narratives of fear that you're feeding. Think of it this way. Have you ever had a friend who asked you how you were doing, then after you got 2 words out, launched into a monologue about something going on in their lives? Did you feel listened to as they talked over you, or did you feel the disconnect between the seeming intent of the question and the actions following it? Their words seemed to focus on you, but ultimately their intent was regarding themselves, so you were left feeling the discomfort and dissonance between their nous and their glossa. Every prayer that would begin in ancient times with a cleansing, usually washing the hands and face, to make one presentable before the gods. This ritual was said to physically wash away miasma, but Also, to mentally prepare the worshiper to approach the gods in sacred space, at the shrine or altar, totally focused on the task at hand. Approach with reverence and at least some measure of excitement and joy, or at the minimum with reverence and appreciation for what has come before. Make sure you've got your offerings ready too, as unless you're doing one of two specific types of prayer, you should probably make sure you offer alongside or just before you begin to pray. Now that you're ready, let's take a look at how prayer actually works. Part 3. Ways to pray. Prayer in Greek Religion by Pulleyn is referenced time and time again in modern scholarship as the authoritative source on the subject, and I'll largely be drawing on it for the remainder of this video. We'll be talking about different ancient structures as we've seen surviving for prayer, as well as the physical positions one usually took in ancient times while praying. Namely, not on your knees with your hands together as Christians typically do today. There's some evidence for personal silent prayer without ritual found primarily in tragedies, but it seems from the majority of our sources to primarily have been a ritualized affair. Pulleyn discusses the issue at length, coming to the conclusion that the cycle of charis established between worshippers and the gods protected the so-called free prayer so long as proper honors and offerings, or theoi, are given regularly and with the god in mind. Posture, stance, even the position of the hands were seen as very important in ancient Greek prayer. The distinction between Uranic and Chthonian, or upper world and lower world aspects of deities, has more to do with practice than it does the nature of the gods themselves, and this is where that distinction becomes important. When praying to the Uranic aspects of a deity, traditionally one would stand, eyes facing upward, arms with palms at a 45-degree angle. Later in Greek history, prayer was depicted with just one arm up, the right for Uranic, the left for Chthonic. Sometimes, the other hand would be balled into a fist with the thumb tucked in, which is thought by scholars to put an extra emphasis on the prayer. An alternative form of Chthonic prayer would involve both arms at the waist, palms facing downward, and according to some authors, sometimes prayers for Chthonic deities, epithets, and the dead would be done lying on the ground. If you have mobility issues or problems raising your arms above your head, the positioning of your palms and hands can be a substitute for standing or raising your arms. Ancient peoples had some pretty shocking opinions of disability due to superstition, but I don't think this came from the gods themselves. Adjust what you need to in order to honor the gods in the way that you would need to. Another interesting bit about posture was that after washing one's hands in lustral water, as I outlined in my miasma video, often worshippers would raise the index and middle fingers of the appropriate hand to their lips silently when making eye contact with the symbol of their god before assuming the prayer position and giving their prayer. This is considered a greeting of a sort by modern scholars, though there's a lot of debate about it. Kneeling was uncommon outside of supplication prayers, though when it happened, it was often during times of desperation. Prayers were traditionally done out loud unless the person was too exhausted physically, as Odysseus was in 444 when he prays in his heart to the river god Phaeacia. Silent prayer is also sometimes done for Aphrodite, as one might not want others to know of one's affections or schemes, likewise to Eros or Hermes, both of which have epithets for silent prayer. The general view, though, is that unless someone is in some sort of danger, the prayers of the just are best spoken out loud, as there's no reason to be ashamed of praying if one's requests are just. That said, if you're in a situation where you must hide your practice, the fact that in times of danger the Greeks are shown to pray in epic silently justifies silent prayers for you until you're able to get into a situation where you can honor them openly in your own space. Don't put yourself at risk for the sake of tradition. Okay, so you've washed your hands, you have your offering, and you've found a comfortable prayer position. Now what? You need to decide which god you're praying to. This decision varies depending on what it is you're asking for. If you're giving a prayer of thanks, then you probably already know who you're thanking for the gifts you've received or the answer you got for a prior prayer. If, however, you're dealing with a need, there are a few ways you can figure out which god is most appropriate. Ancient peoples often had a few main gods or goddesses that they addressed their concerns to, depending on their families and which city-state they lived in. If you know which city-state you're reconstructing from, the main gods of that pantheon are never a bad choice. If you feel close to a particular deity because they called you or because you've built strong charis with them in the past, they're also an option. Sometimes, though, it's good to call on the god who has the strongest interest in the affair that one is asking about. If you're asking about safety for a pet, for example, calling on Artemis would be a good choice. Help with writing? Hermes, the Muses, and Athena. Wisdom? Athena and Zeus. Inspiration? One or all of the Musai or Apollon if it's in the realms of music or poetry, Athena and Hephaestus if it's in the realm of physical crafts. It's good to maintain a good relationship with many gods, as we've seen in the examples of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Neglecting charis with some gods can cause others to ignore you. That doesn't mean obsessively offering to every god you know the name of, but it does mean that maintaining charis with the main gods of the pantheon you're reviving, in my case as an Athenian recon and writer, Athena, Apollon, Hermes, Tyche, the Mosai, Zeus, Demeter because I garden, Hera for marriage, Asclepios and Hygieia for my ongoing health issues, Poseidon because I live near an inland sea, and Hephaestus because of the crafts that I do. I give offerings for other gods on their sacred days when I need help in their areas, but these gods are the ones that I pray most often to outside of their specific days. If you're really not sure, some prayers in antiquity were addressed to all the deathless gods, though that isn't good to do all the time if you want to build individual katas with any of them. Alright, so we've picked the god or gods, what's next? What did the structure of Greek prayer look like? We see a number of different structure, but the typical prayer had 3 parts. The first was the invocation, or calling the god to attention. There are a few ways that this was done. The most common was either hear me or come verbiage, such as hear me O Zeus or come O esteemed and ancestral gods in prayers from antiquity. Sometimes the invocation would be done with just a name or epithet, Zeus of the thundering clouds, but it was more common for the worshipper to request the god's attention directly. I covered epithets in another video briefly, but because so many gods shared some of them, this section also often include references to the things that the gods have done to make sure you've gotten the attention of the right god. For example, Athena has the epithet Hygieia for matters of health, but there's also the goddess Hygieia who is either the wife or daughter of Asclepios. So if you were calling Athena, you'd mention that she was born of Zeus alone, healer of the Acropolis, and she who guides the wisdom of the rulers of humanity, to make sure that it was Athena who answers and not Hygieia. The invocation was often done in tricolon style, or a style in which 3 different references to the god are used. Athena, glorious goddess, born of the head of mighty Zeus, is an example of this. The number 3 was especially sacred in prayer, as we'll see, and when writing your own, keeping this in mind for invocations can help your prayers flow better. The next section of the prayer, the argument, is where the worshipper gives the reason why the prayer should be granted. There are a number of styles of argument discussed through the book. Give because I have given, or arguments on the grounds of the offering being given, are the most common, though variants include give because he or she has given, if you know a friend or loved one has given offerings on your behalf, or give because you have given, referencing blessings, mythic, or in your life that the god has done in the past, or give so that I will give, which states that if you receive the blessing, you will give something you already have in the future. There's another type of prayer here, give so that I may give in the future, which is said in dire times when you're specifically requesting assistance in an area that would enable you to pay the god back for their generosity in the future. So a give because I have given prayer might look like, O Athena, bright Pallas, born of Zeus's head alone, you have guided humanity through all of history in the realm of wisdom and discernment. As I burn this sacred incense to you and pour sacred libations of olive oil and wine, please bless me with your discernment, that I might forever stay on the path of virtue and away from the darkness of human hubris. Glorious goddess, I praise and honor you. A give because he or she has given prayer might look like, O Poseidon, Earthshaker, he who rules over the mighty seas, as your Time from the good and just Zeus, if ever my husband has offered to you libations of sweet wine and incense, remember this now and protect him on his journey through your domain, that I might see him safely home again. Give because you have given might look like, Great Hermes, messenger of the gods, he who was gifted the art of lot divination by the bee nymphs, through all of history you have brought men wisdom through lots and the casting of knuckle bones. As you have guided so many before, guide me now, and impart the wisdom of your father to my throw, that I might know what I must about... Insert your divination question here. Give so that I will give might look or feel like offering a bribe. Hear me, Asclepios, Bian, physician of the gods, heal my infected wound, and I will offer you libations of good wine, burn sweet-smelling frankincense, and perform hymns in your name and that of your father. Heal me as you have so many before, bright physician, and I will give you these offerings so that you may rejoice in them as you did in times long past. Give so that I can give has a similar feel, though also has a stronger justifications if you don't have offering for the god until the blessing is received, as in the previous example, can't give the offering physically until you're made well. O Demeter, Megala Mater, goddess whose bright touch brings fertility to plants and animals alike, bless my garden with your presence, O goddess, multiply its yield, that I might offer you the first fruits of my labors when they ripen on the vine. Another version of this, Emotes, or if ever prayers, are said during really desperate times when a worshipper has no offering to give but instead calls on the history of offerings and blessings given, the whole cycle of Charis, for their plight. These are very rare and shouldn't be leaned on too often, lest the cycle of Charis itself be broken, but they are an option in desperate times. The most famous Emotes prayer comes from Iliad Book 1, lines 33 through 40, in which the old priest Chryses plays to Apollon while unable to make a sacrifice. He went forth in silence along the shore of the loud resounding sea and earned earnestly then, when he had gone apart, the old man prayed to Lord Apollon, whom fair-haired Leto bore, "Hear me, O god of the silver bow, who stands over Chryse and holy Kilia, and rule mightily over Tenedos. Minthi and God, if ever I have roofed the temple to your pleasing, or if ever I have burnt to you fat thigh pieces of bulls and goats, fulfill this prayer from me. Let the Danaans pay for my tears by your arrows." So he spoke in prayer, and Phoebus Apollon heard him. Chrysos calls upon the whole of his Caris with Apollon, and Apollon responds by raining a fury of arrows on those assaulting Chrysos' people and who stole his daughter. The argument stage doesn't need to be given if the prayer is simply to accept the offering or specifically to give thanks, unless you're requesting more blessings for the future after the thanks has been given, in which case the thanks would actually function as your offering and the prayer becomes a give because you have given type of prayer. The next stage of prayer is typically the request. As mentioned prior, this could merely be to accept the offering and the honor, or to accept a worshipper's thanks. But more often than not, we need things from the gods. It's good to make sure your argument matches your request. Talking about how Artemis takes care of newborn children isn't really much use when asking her for help in a hunt, but it's quite helpful if someone you love just gave birth or if an animal you love just did. Some folks present the offering before the prayer, some after. I tend to split my offerings between the beginning and the end, presenting physical offerings like incense or food offerings at the start of a prayer and pouring a libation of some kind at the end to seal the prayer. Most prayers in literature have the offerings either in the middle or at the beginning of prayers, but libations are typically at the end. See what feels best for you, and make sure if you're honoring multiple gods that it's clear to whom each offering is being given. Remember that in any home ritual, Hestia is called and offered to first and last, preferably with a flame of some kind or a representation of one, either burning or glowing during said prayer, as she is the heart that connects us to the rest of the gods. That said, in prayers for the dead, Hermes, Gaia, Hyades, and Persephone, or just Hyades and Persephone, were prayed to and offered to in the chthonic fashion before the prayer to the dead began. This included hero cults, as the majority of heroes, despite being children of the gods, were still treated similarly to ordinary dead, apart from being seen as active around their gravesites more often than the ancestors of ordinary humans. Prayers to the dead typically were non-specific, asking for good things, and often revolved around the fertility of the land especially, as the dead were thought to have some influence on this. They weren't performed very frequently, typically on the birthday of the deceased and on the yearly Athenian Gymnasia, though sometimes folks would visit Nekiomanteon, or oracles of the dead, to receive answers to specific questions from dead relatives. These prayers were typically performed at grave sites or the sites of heroic burials and not in the home, as the deads were considered polluting and miasmic, as were underworld deities and epithets. If you don't have a gravesite to visit, at the minimum a separate shrine for underworld deities and your ancestors would be recommended here, preferably outside if you can manage it. If you're performing a devotional offering, which I covered more in depth in the video in the iCard, the process for the prayer is the same, but the inner purity we talked about extends through the entire time you're performing the actions devoted to the god. If those actions are traditional, such as reciting poetry or playing music in honor of deities or composing it for future performance, this shouldn't be too difficult, but if you're crafting a votive offering or offering the action of crafting something for someone else, distracting yourself with, say, a video or a podcast, or doing so in a noisy or distracting area probably wouldn't be a good idea. If you've ever watched a play where the audience heckles and distracts the performers, you've seen how distraction can adversely affect the effect you're going for. Hermes would be invoked first and last here instead of Hestia for devotional offerings, or the Muses if the offering was a performance of music or poetry or dance. Votive offerings, which I also covered in more depth in their own video, link in the iCard, cannot be used for anything else once they're on the shrine. That means a votive necklace should never be worn again, a votive candle holder never used for a non-sacred purpose, votive incense burner never used outside of ritual, votive statues can't be used for decoration apart from the shrine, etc. Many of these were also inscribed with a reminder to the god that they were given as to why, and the prayers that accompanied them in thanks would be much longer and more heartfelt and intense. Many votives are given in thanks rather than for requests, and the collection of them on your shrines can serve as a physical reminder of the events that moved you to offer them in the first place. A final note I need to cover is the attitude in prayer. The arguments you make can never be coercive or threatening, because there was a notion of hosios, or piety, and the correct inner attitude toward the gods. The gods don't owe you anything, no matter how many offerings you've given or how special you think you are in their eyes. The relationship between you, like all relationships, is entirely voluntary, and it pays to remember that the gods are bigger than you. Often prayers close out ritual, thanking the gods for hearing you and entreating them to never leave your life, while giving a final libation to Hestia. These prayers are a reminder that Caris doesn't end when you walk away from the ritual space or altar, and that the happenings in your life, along with your actions, are still a part of your relationship with them. The gods know when you're not putting in the work on your end to bring about the desired outcome. We don't walk away from ritual space entirely absolved of responsibility from then on. The gods may bring the rain, but you must till the field and plant the seeds, and in the modern day, water when the rains don't come. The gods may play a part in the outcome, but your effort must always be a consideration as well. If If you pray for a new job and don't put in a single application, you can't turn around and complain to the gods when you don't get a call back. Well, you can, but it won't be very effective and may actually be anhalcyon, which no Hellenist wants to be. Remember always to recognize the gods in the good things in your life, as well as in treating them for help when times get bad. In the same way that a friend appreciates when you recognize good things they've done and is thereby encouraged to do more in the future, the gods too seem to respond well to an attitude of thankfulness. This doesn't mean forfeiting your agency, as I mentioned just before, because you put work in on your side as well. But it does mean the difference between pride, or recognizing your own accomplishment, and hubris, which is placing them above the gods. Remember that charis takes time to develop, and offerings and such aren't always a guarantee of the specific results you want. Gods are not slot machines. They're wondrous and awe-inspiring beings that we can't possibly begin to understand fully in our short lifetimes. It's incredible to think that they can build relationships with us and have been doing so for millennia. We stand on the shoulders of ancestors of faith, and the fact that so many of our traditions have been passed down despite the best efforts of monotheistic hegemony is incredible and itself worthy of praise and gratitude. Our gods live, and they await your prayers, should you hear the call to give them. Thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, burn the subscribe button in offering and banish the like for its distraction and impurity. Drop down into the comments and let me know if you feel like you understand prayer and piety better from revisiting it, or if there are aspects to prayer you want me to cover more in detail in future videos. Special thanks also to my patrons, and to those who have sent me books off my wish list recently. Specifically, Ikeda purchased Coping with the Gods, Wayward Weedings in Greek Mythology for my birthday, and I'm excited to dig into it. Challenging our assumptions about theology can be really helpful as we get further along in our path, and I look forward to diving into some of the things that scholars pull from myth that I might not have noticed, even if I disagree with them in their arguments by the end. Someone also kindly picked up Rethinking Greek Religion from JACandQuill, though there wasn't a gift receipt, so I'm not really sure who to thank. May the cycles of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, we're stronger together.